Today, we are diving into a really tough but absolutely essential story from modern medicine. It's about the lie of a safe antidepressant and how a drug called paroxetine ended up hiding a massive risk for young people. So the big question we're tackling here is this. How on earth did a drug that was sold as this huge step forward in safety end up concealing a deadly secret from the very people it was supposed to be helping? To really get it, we've got to rewind the clock a bit. All right, first up, we need to picture the medical world back in the 1980s. You know, depression was finally being seen as a treatable brain issue, but the tools that doctors had to work with, well, they were pretty complicated. See, the older antidepressants, the ones called tricyclics or TCAs, they definitely worked for a lot of people. And it's a big but, they came with a heavy price. We're talking significant side effects, worries about heart toxicity, and maybe the most frightening part, they could be lethal in an overdose. This made them a really risky choice for everyday long-term care outside of a hospital. And this right here just lays it all out, doesn't it? On one side, you've got the old guard. They work, but they have some serious safety issues. And on the other, you've got the promise of something new. Fewer side effects, and here's the key, a much, much lower chance of being deadly in an overdose. You can see why there was this huge demand, both medically and socially, for exactly this kind of drug. Now, what's really fascinating here is the story science was telling at the time. The big idea was something called the monoamine hypothesis. It often got boiled down to a simple concept. Depression is just a chemical imbalance, a lack of serotonin. Now, while that was a helpful idea for researchers, this oversimplified story created the perfect marketing narrative for a whole new class of drugs designed to do one thing: target serotonin. So let's look at how this promise of safety, plus a really convincing scientific story, basically launched paroxetine into the stratosphere. It became a superstar drug. And its rise was just incredibly fast. It was developed in the 80s by the company that would later become GlaxoSmithKline, or GSK. It gets approved for adults in the early 90s, and by the end of that decade, wow, it wasn't just for depression anymore. It was a blockbuster drug for anxiety, and it was one of the most prescribed medications on the planet. But here is the absolute crucial point in this whole story. The drug was officially approved for adults, only adults. But out in the real world, doctors started prescribing it off-label to teenagers and kids. They were working under a big assumption that the safety and the benefits they saw in adults would just naturally apply to younger people too. And that assumption was about to be seriously challenged. Because behind all the shiny marketing, the incredible sales numbers, and all the doctors prescribing it, a much, much darker story was beginning to emerge, and it was buried deep inside the company's own data. You know, the first red flags weren't numbers on a spreadsheet, they were stories. You had doctors, you had families coming forward and reporting these weird reactions in young people who had just started the medication. Things like sudden jumps in anxiety, real agitation, and impulsivity. But because these were just individual cases, they often got brushed aside as anecdotal, not hard proof. And right here, this is the absolute core of the problem. GlaxoSmithKline, the company that made the drug, owned all the data from all the studies they ran. They held all the cards. They got to decide which trial results got published and which ones, well, stayed in a filing cabinet. So doctors, regulators, everyone, they were only seeing part of the story.
The moment that changed everything, the real turning point, came in the early 2000s. After years of questions and whispers, a group of independent researchers finally got their hands on that hidden data. They weren't just looking at the studies the company wanted them to see. They were looking at the whole shebang. And what they found was just staggering. 2 times. When they pooled all the data together, the published and the unpublished, it showed that adolescents taking paroxetine were twice as likely to experience suicidal thoughts or behaviors compared to kids taking a placebo, a simple sugar pill. All those anecdotal warnings, they weren't just stories. They were a real statistically proven danger.
So what happens when this kind of undeniable proof comes out? It's really interesting to see how the system reacted. This was a massive test for regulators and for the entire medical world.
The whole thing unfolded in about 3 stages. First, more scientists jumped in and confirmed the findings. Yep, the risk was real. Second, the regulators took decisive action. The FDA slapped a black box warning on the label. That's the most serious warning a drug can have, and it spelled out the increased suicide risk in young people loud and clear. And third, the lawsuits started flying, leading to huge settlements against GSK for how they handled the data.
But listen, it would be a huge mistake to just point the finger at one company and say bad guy. The Paroxetine story ripped the curtain back on a massive systemic failure. The fact that any company could just choose to publish its good results and hide its bad ones, that was a fundamental flaw in the very system designed to keep us all safe.
So, after all that, what lasting good came out of this terrible crisis? What did we learn, and how is medicine actually safer today because this all happened?
The legacy, it turns out, is profound. This whole scandal was a huge push for what we now call the clinical trial transparency movement. It led to rules that require all trials, good or bad, to be registered publicly before they even start. It also hammered home the lesson that kids are not just tiny adults. Drugs can hit them in completely different ways. And finally, it forced everyone to rethink that simple serotonin deficiency story, pushing science towards a much more nuanced and honest understanding of depression. The story of Paroxetine literally changed medical ethics and data transparency forever. It's such a powerful reminder that good science isn't just about breakthroughs, it's about complete, total honesty. And that leaves us with a really important question to think about. What are the blind spots we might still have today?